Hello, my name is Maggie Pierce. I'm 67 years old, and last week at my grandson's birthday party, my daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said, "You embarrass me. I'm disgusted by you." I stood there with a plate of homemade pie in my hands. Pie I baked for the boy I helped raise while everyone looked away. They thought I would stay quiet, walk away, and disappear like an old stain on a clean floor. But they forgot one thing: I still remember everything, and this time I kept the receipts. This is a family story you won't forget. Stay with me. Vanessa raised her glass, smiling brightly in the middle of the party, then suddenly turned and said, "You embarrass me. I'm disgusted by you." There was a quiet pause, sharp and brief, like a hiccup in a song. The music kept playing. The guests kept chatting, but Maggie stood still. The chair to Vanessa's right, once always hers, had been pushed back just slightly. It wasn't an accident. It was the kind of thing done with a steady hand and a practiced smile. The room glowed with spring sunlight slanting through high windows. The cake was already cut, laughter floating across polished floors, and Caleb, turning 22 today, stood at the center of it all. His face was a mixture of guilt and discomfort. He kept glancing at her, then looking away. Earlier that morning, Maggie had baked Caleb's favorite warm apple pie, just the way he liked it, with a golden crust and cinnamon sugar dusted like snow. She'd placed it gently in a glass dish, wrapped in cloth, and brought it over. No one had asked her to. No one ever did anymore. She had worn a soft cardigan, the one Greg once said made her look cozy, like home. Her son now sat at the far end of the table, sipping from his wineglass, eyes fixed on nothing. Vanessa's voice had been loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, but no one turned. No one said a word. The shame slid over her like a second skin, unwelcome, but already familiar. Maggie smiled faintly and stood up, still holding the dessert plate. Her hands didn't shake. Vanessa turned away as if nothing had happened, her laugh easily resuming. Someone else filled her glass. Greg didn't look at her, not once. Caleb, caught mid-sentence with a friend, opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Maggie placed the plate of pie untouched on the side table. She didn't want to ruin the celebration. She had always believed in not making a fuss, especially on someone else's day. But she couldn't sit back down. The chair was no longer hers, not really. It had been moved for a reason. She walked toward the front door heels, soft against the wooden floor. Her coat was still hanging neatly by the entrance, but she didn't put it on. As she reached the door, she paused and turned. The dining table stretched before her, filled with the people she once called family. Years ago, she would have been in the center, laughing, pouring tea, making sure everyone had enough on their plates. Now no one looked up. No one noticed she was leaving. Not even Greg. Outside, a breeze rustled the orange tree by the porch, the one Maggie had planted decades ago when Caleb was still in diapers. The scent of citrus floated lightly in the air. A single orange leaf drifted down. The door clicked shut behind her. A leaf from the orange tree fell on the porch just as the door slammed behind her. "Can you call a cab for me?" Caleb whispered into her ear as the others cleared the table. Maggie didn't turn to look at him. She just nodded, almost imperceptibly, the corner of her mouth twitching in what could have been a thank you or a sigh. Around them, laughter resumed. Plates clinked. A candle was relit. No one noticed that her chair remained empty. When she walked out, no one followed. Outside, the evening air was cool and damp. A soft spring rain had begun to fall, more mist than drizzle, but enough to blur the porch light and make the wooden steps slippery. Maggie stood under the awning, a small worn suitcase beside her. It held just enough: a nightgown, her medication, a framed photo of Caleb from when he was 10, and a wool sweater that smelled faintly of cedar. Caleb had brought the suitcase out quietly. Before retreating into the house, he slipped a folded note into her palm. She waited until the cab had pulled away before opening it. One line, Dad's old lawyer. He always liked you. C. Beneath that, a name and phone number scrawled in haste. The taxi took her just one street over, but it felt like crossing an ocean. The neighborhood lights were dim and gentle. Raindrops tapped against the windows like fingers seeking attention. As the car slowed near a familiar driveway, Maggie spotted the glow of a warm lamp through lace curtains. She didn't need to knock. Before she could raise her hand, the door opened. Maggie Martha Hill's voice was soft but surprised. What on earth? Come in before you catch your death. Maggie stepped inside, shoulders damp from the rain. The scent of something floral and baked apples filled the small home, familiar, steady. I won't stay long, Maggie said, setting her suitcase gently on the rug. Nonsense. Sit. I'll make tea. They settled into the living room, two women of a certain age surrounded by doilies and old photographs. Maggie sat on a wooden chair with a thin cushion, her fingers resting on the armrest, as if trying to steady herself. It was just a small thing, she said quietly. But somehow it was enough to erase me. Martha said nothing, only handed her a mug of steaming tea and sat across from her waiting. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was understanding. Martha had known Greg since he was a boy, had babysat Caleb once or twice when Maggie was still working part-time at the school. The walls around them held pictures that hadn't moved in decades, frames, slightly tilted corners faded. Maggie's eyes landed on one wall in particular. The photo that had once included her Caleb's graduation was gone. In its place was a more recent image, Vanessa, Greg, and Caleb at a formal dinner. Her own face had vanished. She didn't mention it. She didn't need to. Instead, her eyes wandered over the familiar space, the ceramic bowl filled with dried lavender, the tiny footstool crocheted in soft yellow, the painting of the lake Martha never got around to framing properly. It all made her feel seen, in a way that was almost harder to bear. Climax came not with words, but with realization that this small borrowed warmth from someone not bound to her by blood was more comforting than the hollow indifference of her own family. And that hurt in its own quiet way. Martha, perhaps sensing the heaviness, rose and walked to the old sideboard. She opened a drawer and rummaged for a moment before pulling something out. She turned, holding a dusty photo frame. Her eyes crinkled as she smiled. Do you remember the orange blossom party we had here? Caleb was what? 7. You made lemonade and little sandwiches. He wore that ridiculous paper crown. She handed the frame to Maggie. Maggie looked down. In the photo, a younger version of herself knelt beside a grinning Caleb orange blossoms woven into both their hair. Behind them, the tree in full bloom, sunlight slanting across the lawn. A reminder of a time she had belonged. A leaf from the orange tree fell on the porch, just as the door slammed behind her. Maggie opened an old paperback resting on the nightstand in Martha's guest room, and out fell a crumpled letter signed R.A. It landed face down on the quilt, the edges yellowed and fragile. Maggie hesitated before picking it up. The spine of the book crackled faintly as it closed, as though the words inside had waited too long to be read. Morning sunlight spilled across the room, filtered through thin curtains that fluttered with the breeze. It was her first full morning outside of her own home, though calling it her own now felt hollow. She had barely slept. The bed was soft but unfamiliar, and her dreams had been noisy, with fragments of laughter, of footsteps, walking away, of her name being whispered and then forgotten. Martha had knocked gently a few minutes earlier, bringing a small tray with toast butter and tea. The aroma of cinnamon drifted faintly behind her. Maggie had thanked her with a soft smile, then sat in silence for a while, hands curled around the warm ceramic cup. She noticed the book, a familiar title she had once lent to a friend years ago. Curious, she reached for it, flipped the pages halfway. And that's when the letter fell. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was neat, but slanted, like someone writing in a hurry while trying to stay composed. The ink had faded in parts. No date, no salutation. But halfway down, a line jumped out, "She knows who I really am now." And that changes everything. Maggie blinked, then read it again. The pronouns swam in her mind, unanchored. Near the bottom, it was signed simply R.A., a name she didn't recognize, or perhaps didn't yet remember. She pressed the letter flat against her lap and stared out the window. The tree outside swayed gently. In the distance, she could see the roof of her old home barely peeking above the hedge. For a moment, it felt like her breath caught, like she was looking at a place that had once been hers, now shuttered and foreign. The sound of her phone vibrating broke the silence. "Hi, Grandma." Caleb's voice was low, hesitant. "I'm all right," she replied softly before he even asked. "It's just for a few days." He didn't argue. He never did, but the silence on the other end lingered. "You didn't take the pie," he finally said. "No," she said. "Didn't seem like anyone wanted it." More silence. Then, "If you need anything, I know, sweetheart." She paused. "You take care." After the call, she sat quietly. Then she opened her bag, pulled out a small notepad she always carried in her purse. She began to write, not full thoughts, not conclusions, just fragments. Photo frame gone. Orange tree cut back Greg's voice colder. Letter R.A. Who? And then from memory, one more line, Vanessa. "You don't need to know anything about my past." Maggie stared at those words. Her hands no longer trembled. There was something forming in her chest, not quite anger, not yet, but something steadier, a curiosity with weight. She looked at the letter again, carefully folded it, and slid it into her coat pocket. "R.A.," she whispered. "Who are you?" Her gaze lifted, still soft, but no longer defeated. "Ah. Who are you?" she whispered, folding the letter into her coat pocket. Her eyes no longer looked like they did yesterday. That night, Maggie dreamt of the orange tree in front of her house being split in two, its roots jutting out from the ground like broken fingers. She woke before dawn, the image still fresh. A cool breeze filtered through the window of Martha's guest room. The blanket had slipped off her shoulder, and for a moment she didn't move, still half lost in the dream, where something beautiful had been cut down without warning, left raw and exposed. By the time the sun had begun to rise, Maggie had made her way to the small bench in Martha's backyard. The birds were chirping with the joy of spring, but her hands were cold around the ceramic mug, the tea inside untouched and cooling. She stared at the lawn, letting her mind drift back years, decades. The orange tree hadn't always been there. It was her husband Daniel who planted it. It was right after her recovery, the illness that nearly took her away. He didn't say much, just dug the soil with quiet care, placed the young tree in the ground, and told her, "Something sweet for every spring we get to share from now on." And they did. For a while. She never imagined it could be gone. Couldn't sleep. Martha's voice was soft as she stepped outside with her own cup. Maggie shook her head. Strange dream. The orange tree. It was being chopped down. Only roots were left. Like fingers. Martha sat beside her, nodding thoughtfully. Dreams can be cruel that way. I still dream about my cherry tree sometimes. The one we lost 2 years ago when the storm hit. It wasn't the tree I missed so much. but the way it looked from my kitchen window, like someone you expect to wave at you every day. Maggie smiled, faintly grateful for the metaphor. Trees lose their leaves so they can keep living, Martha added gently, not to die. Before Maggie could respond, her phone buzzed. The screen showed Greg's name. She hesitated, then answered. Hi, Mum. Greg's voice came through distant and dry. I just wanted to let you know. Vanessa and I are clearing out the storage in the garage. Your old stuff's been sitting there for years. Maggie's grip tightened on the mug. There are boxes labeled Mum's Things. We'll probably toss most of them. You didn't take anything when you left. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Through the phone, she could hear a low rumble, a humming mechanical sound in the background. Is that? She started her voice, almost a whisper. Oh yeah, the masonry saw. We're tearing down the back wall to make space for new shelves. Of course. The garage. That was where Daniel used to keep everything. His old toolbox, the folder of legal papers, the photographs. The small safe he never talked about, but always kept under the workbench. Maggie closed her eyes. She could almost hear the rhythm of Daniel's hammer, the soft radio in the background, the smell of sawdust and orange blossoms drifting in through the open door. I just thought you should know, Greg added. No warmth, no questions. Just facts. When the call ended, she didn't move right away. She stared ahead at the garden, her breath quiet but uneven. Martha gently touched her elbow. Everything all right? Maggie nodded once, but her voice came out as a whisper, almost to herself. Is there anything left in there? She whispered. That afternoon, the sun slanted low in the sky, casting long golden strips across the quiet street. Maggie stood at the edge of the driveway, her eyes fixed on the slightly ajar garage door of the house that once held her entire life. The main lights were off. No car in the driveway. Greg and Vanessa must have been out. She waited a moment longer, listening. No sound. Then she stepped forward. The garage smelled like old oil and damp wood. Dust floated in the shafts of light that pierced through the half-opened door. Her footsteps echoed softly as she stepped over coiled hoses and rusted boxes. There was a stillness here that felt sacred, untouched, since her husband had passed. She ran her fingers along the old workbench, where his tools once lined up with near military precision. Now it was a mess of cobwebs and bent nails. A sudden memory flared him, crouched beside the lawnmower grease on his hands, smiling up at her with a wink. She blinked hard and moved on. Beneath an old tarp, she uncovered a box. Inside were yellowed photographs, a cracked ceramic mug Caleb made in school, and a faded notepad with her husband's familiar handwriting. Her fingers lingered on the pages. Receipts, scribbled thoughts, instructions for home repairs. Nothing extraordinary, but they smelled like him. They felt like safety. Then she saw it, a flat envelope, wedged under a folded piece of cloth. Maggie pulled it free, heart suddenly quickening. The paper was thick, the seal brittle with age. Inside were property documents. Her name. Her husband's signature. It clearly stated she was a co-owner of the house and the land. But Vanessa had told her so plainly with that cutting certainty that Greg had inherited everything that legally it was never yours. Maggie's knees weakened. She gripped the envelope tighter, her breath uneven. Why had they lied? She took out her phone and snapped a photo of the papers. The documents trembled slightly in her hand, but not from fear, from something deeper. Something long buried. She folded the envelope carefully and tucked it into her coat. Outside, the faint rumble of an engine reached her ears. Greg's car. She glanced out the small side window. Not much time. Maggie slipped out through the back heart, thudding not from panic, but from a strange, rising hope. Later that evening, alone in Martha's guest room, she opened the folded paper Caleb had given her. A phone number was scrawled in his careful print. With a deep breath, she dialed. The line clicked, and a calm male voice came through. Joseph Randall speaking. Martha set the warm apple pie on the table, the scent curling through the kitchen like a memory come alive. I remember someone used to make this every month when Caleb was little. She said, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Maggie stared at the pie. The lattice crust reminded her of the one she had baked just days ago, left untouched at Caleb's birthday party. That pie never even made it to the dessert table. She reached for her tea, but didn't drink. Instead, she pulled a folded sheet of paper from her cardigan pocket and slid it across the table. I went back to the garage, she said. Martha looked up, startled. You what? I had to see it. Maggie replied, voice calm but firm. The place where William used to work. I thought there might be something left. And Maggie opened the copy she had made of the property document. This was hidden beneath a stack of fabric in one of his old boxes. It has my name on it. Vanessa told me everything was in Greg's name. Martha leaned closer, eyes narrowing as she read. But this says I know what it says, Maggie cut in gently. It means I wasn't just forgotten. I was erased. Silence settled over them. The rain outside had turned steady now, tapping a rhythm against the window panes. Martha set her fork down. You're saying they knew you still had a claim? Maggie nodded slowly. I remember something Martha said, rubbing her temples as if trying to smooth out a wrinkle in time. Years ago, I overheard Vanessa on the phone with her husband. She was pacing the porch, didn't know I was on the other side of the hedge. She said, one day, that old woman won't have anything left to fight with. I thought she meant it metaphorically. But now, a soft buzzing broke the quiet. Maggie's phone lit up. Caleb. She hesitated, then answered. Hi, dear. His voice came through hesitant and thin. Grandma? Are you okay? I'm fine, sweetheart, she said, eyes not leaving Martha. But there are a few things I need to ask you. A pause on the other end. I'll come by tomorrow. Is that okay? Tomorrow's fine. After the call, Maggie sat still for a moment, letting her thoughts circle like birds returning to the same tree. She glanced down at her pocket, at the hidden weight it held. Martha reached across the table, her voice softer now. Do you think Caleb knows? I think Maggie said slowly. He knows more than he's allowed to say. Martha tilted her head. You mentioned a letter the other day. Maggie stood and walked to the drawer near the window. The light caught on the brass handle as she pulled it open. From inside, she took out the crumpled letter she had found tucked in the novel, the signature still faint but legible R.A. She returned to the table and laid it beside the document. Martha, you once said you saw Vanessa receive a letter. Yes. A while ago. It didn't come through the mailbox, it was delivered by hand. The return name wasn't Greg's. It was someone else's. Riley, I think. Maggie froze. She said it wasn't important. Martha added quickly, but her face changed when she read it, like it hit something raw. Maggie picked up the letter. Her fingers didn't tremble this time. Maybe it's time I found out who that girl really is. Maybe it's time I found out who that girl really is. Your husband hired me, Joseph Randall said, voice low and rough like gravel under tires, but he passed away before we could finish what we started. The cafe was nearly empty, just the two of them in the back corner, near the frosted window that looked out onto the grey square behind the old courthouse. Outside, the wind rustled the few remaining cherry blossoms. Inside, the smell of old coffee and rain-damp coats clung to the air. Maggie folded her hands in her lap, watching him. Joseph was older than she remembered, broad-shouldered eyes, weary but alert. His coat was worn, but clean. A man who noticed details and remembered things others forgot. "What did my husband ask you to look into?" she asked quietly. Joseph took a slow sip from his chipped mug before answering. He had a feeling that someone was tampering with the property deeds. He said things didn't add up. "I started digging, but he got sick. Then he was gone." Maggie nodded slowly, then slid a copy of the property document across the table. "I found this in the garage. Hidden." Joseph leaned forward, studied the page. "That's real," he murmured. "No doubt. But it's not in the city archive anymore. Someone changed the official record after his death. About 8 months after." Her breath caught. Why wait so long? He shrugged, but his eyes darkened. Because that's when everything settles. Wills claims titles. If someone had access and a motive, they could change ownership without triggering alarms, especially if no one's looking. Maggie looked down at the table. Her teacup sat untouched. Joseph hesitated. "Does the name Riley Adams mean anything to you?" Maggie's eyes flicked up. Her hand tightened around her purse strap. "Yes," she said. "It's come up recently." Joseph reached into his leather folder and pulled out a photograph. The image was slightly blurred, clearly taken from a distance. Vanessa stood on a sidewalk, hand on the shoulder of a teenage girl, mid-teens, dark hair guarded expression. That's Riley. Her daughter. Not Greg's. Vanessa had her before she met him. Maggie took the photo gently, eyes narrowing. "No one in our family ever mentioned her." "Exactly," Joseph replied. "Because they didn't know. Riley's been hidden. But I think she was used to file paperwork on Vanessa's behalf. Certain records can be accessed if you're next of kin. Vanessa may have created a narrative that made Riley seem legally entitled." Maggie's mind spun. The forged updates, the vanishing deed, the cold dismissals, it all pointed in the same direction. Joseph lowered his voice, leaning closer. "I think Riley is the key to everything that got switched. I think Riley is the key to everything that got switched." The last time we all sat together in this kitchen, Maggie said, her gaze drifting to the chipped paint on the corner cupboard, was right after I came home from the hospital. Dust floated in the fading light, streaming through the window slats. The kitchen, once the warm, fragrant heart of the house, was nearly empty now. The long wooden table wore a fine layer of grey. A single chair creaked when Caleb gently pulled it out for her. "I thought Vanessa kept this door locked," Maggie said. "She does," Caleb replied. "But I know where she hides the key." He watched her scan the room slowly, eyes pausing on small ghosts, the spot where William used to leave notes on the fridge, the drawer where Greg once stashed cookies as a boy. Maggie walked with reverence, her hand brushing the edges of a life once lived. In the pantry closet behind a loose panel, she found what she was looking for, a small wooden box with her handwriting still faintly visible on the lid. Inside were folded index cards, recipes in her careful cursive, and beneath them, the old family photo album. She exhaled gently, touching the worn leather cover. "This is all I came for." Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Greg appeared in the doorway, stiff in posture but not surprised. "Mom," he said, voice low. "What are you doing here?" Vanessa was clear. Maggie didn't flinch. "I'm not here for a fight. I came to reclaim what's mine." Greg looked at the box in her hands, then at the chair Caleb had drawn out. His jaw tightened. "This place isn't the same anymore." "You know that." "I do," she said quietly. "But memory doesn't live in drywall." It lives in the people who remember. He didn't reply, only sighed a long, tired sound from a man pulled in too many directions for too long. "You look like your father when you do that," she said. "Not just in the face. In the way you carry weight. You shouldn't have to." Greg turned away. Caleb stood by the window, staring out at the garden. "Bah," he said after a moment. "Do you think—" "She hid things from me too." Riley Adams was admitted to St. Mary's in 2019, Joseph said, flipping open a worn manila folder. But the person who signed the medical guarantor form was Greg Pierce. Maggie sat motionless across the desk. Outside the office window, the wind whistled, brushing dried leaves against the glass. The room smelled faintly of weak coffee and old paper, its walls lined with mismatched filing cabinets, the kind with labels half peeled and corners dented. She leaned closer, eyes scanning the form. Greg's signature. His name printed under father. "That can't be right," she whispered. "Greg has only one child." "Caleb?" "He never mentioned—" "Another." Joseph didn't respond at first. Instead, he retrieved a second folder and laid it gently on the desk. Inside were 2 sheets of paper and a printed email thread. "I sent a message to Riley. Took some digging, but I found an address linked to her school records. This morning," she replied. Maggie's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the printout. Riley's response was brief. "Careful, I didn't know they still talked about me. I haven't seen her in a long time." "She means," Vanessa Maggie asked. Joseph nodded. "Likely. Riley seems distant, like someone who's had to move on, perhaps out of self-preservation." Maggie folded her hands in her lap. Her thoughts drifted to the girl in the photo, eyes, wary, posture stiff. "Do you think she even knows what happened, or how deep she's been pulled into this?" "I'm not sure," Joseph said. "But I don't think she's the architect here. More like a piece that's been used." Maggie exhaled slowly. "Then maybe she deserves a letter. A different kind of one." Joseph pushed a blank sheet and a pen across the table. Maggie began to write, not as an accuser, but as a woman who had once known warmth and trust, and now faced their absence like a long winter. "Dear Riley, I don't know what you've been told or what you remember. But if you still have anything from your mother, anything she once gave you, please keep it safe. It may one day help someone who loved her as if they were family." She signed it with just her first name, folded the paper, and passed it back to Joseph. "Do you want to send a return address?" he asked. "No," she said. "Not yet." That evening, her phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number, a photo, a simple wooden picture frame aged and scratched. And on the back, faded but still legible, "Never let them erase this. MP." The wind moved through the backyard like an old friend brushing past soft, but with purpose. Maggie sat beneath the great oak tree, its thick branches casting restless shadows over the grass. Beside her, Martha clutched a cup of tea steam curling upward before dissolving into the spring air. The chimes above them sang gently in the breeze, creating a rhythm that filled their shared silence. "I once saw Vanessa forge a signature," Martha said suddenly, her voice, low eyes fixed on the distant hedge. Maggie turned to her slowly. "What did you say?" "It was December 2019, just before Christmas. I remember because of the scent, cinnamon and wet wool. I'd borrowed a casserole dish and went to return it. Their dining room curtain was open. I saw her at the table with a stack of papers. She wasn't writing normally. She was tracing something. It looked deliberate, careful. That wasn't her signature." Maggie said nothing at first. She looked down at the photo Riley had sent, an old wooden frame with a faint inscription on the back. Don't ever let anyone erase this. MP. The carving felt like a whisper from another time, a time when her name still meant something in that house. I didn't say anything then, Martha continued. I didn't think it was my place. But I never forgot. She always acted like no one would ever find out, like consequences weren't meant for her. Maggie turned the frame in her hand, her thumb brushing the edges. Would you be willing to write that down as a statement? In case I need it. Martha hesitated, then gave a slow nod. If it helps you get back even a piece of what was yours. Yes, I'll do it. Maggie offered a faint smile, grateful but exhausted. The wind picked up again, rattling the chimes, as if stirring the truth from the branches. There's something else, Martha added, her tone changing. I saw Vanessa go into a law office once. It was around the time the old will supposedly vanished. Maggie's head lifted. Do you remember where? Yes. It was downtown. I was in the car while Howard picked up his blood pressure pills across the street. She walked into a building with a brass plate on the front. Greystone and Coal, I think it said. Maggie's breath caught slightly as she committed the name to memory. Greystone and Coal. The wind shifted, and the oak leaves above them trembled as if listening too. The office building was old enough that its walls creaked slightly when the wind pressed against them. Greystone and Coal had once been a prominent name in town, etched in brass on the front door that now looked dulled by years of sun and rain. Joseph held it open for Maggie and motioned her inside. Quiet on weekends, he murmured. No one to ask questions. The entry smelled faintly of paper wood polish and something older like time itself. A single desk lamp glowed in the back, and a silver-haired woman looked up from behind the reception. Her eyes narrowed as she saw Maggie. You're... She hesitated. Maggie Pierce? Maggie nodded, heart rising in her throat. I remember your husband. Kind man. Came in once or twice with Joseph. Never liked the woman he brought after. Joseph offered a tight smile. We're looking for a file from 2018. Drafted by Charles Ralston, he handled estate planning. Should be under Gregory Pierce. The woman disappeared into the back, her heels tapping softly across tile. Moments later, she returned with a thick folder wrapped in a faded red ribbon. Joseph opened it carefully on the counter. Maggie leaned in. There it was, her name written beside Greg's under property co-ownership. And in the margin, status pending, awaiting client confirmation. This was never finalized? Maggie whispered. Joseph pointed to a stamped note, client deceased. No follow-up. No follow-up because someone made sure no one followed up, he muttered. This should have been processed. All someone had to do was confirm your address. But instead, they filed it away like it never happened. Maggie stared at the page. Her hand trembled slightly, not with weakness, but clarity. I want a copy, she said. The receptionist nodded and disappeared again. Joseph flipped to the last page. There's also a memo, he said, reading. From Charles. Says he received a call from Vanessa Pierce 3 days after Greg's death, asking what would happen to joint assets if only one name appeared on the final paperwork. Maggie closed her eyes. The pieces no longer floated, they clicked into place. When the copy arrived, she pulled a pen from her bag and wrote in the corner, April 12th, the day everything changes. Joseph looked at her with the quiet seriousness he'd carried since their first meeting. Are you ready to go to court if it comes to that? He asked. Maggie folded the papers carefully, her voice steady. I don't need to win. I just need my son to know the truth. The house was quiet at that hour, the kind of silence that settles like a blanket over everything. Maggie sat alone in Martha's living room. the old lamp casting a soft golden glow across the wooden floor. The ticking of the wall clock was the only sound, steady and unchanging. Then the phone rang. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up. "Hello? Is this Maggie Pierce?" The voice was young female, a little shaky, but unmistakably real. "Yes." "Who's this?" A pause. "My name is Riley. Riley Adams." Maggie sat up straighter, heart thudding quietly. "I wasn't sure I should call," Riley continued. "But I got your letter. And the way you wrote it didn't feel like something from someone trying to trap me. It felt like kindness." Maggie swallowed the lump in her throat. "Thank you for calling, sweetheart. I remember you," Riley said suddenly. "You were in a few pictures when I was little. Mum told me not to ask about them. She said you moved away." Maggie exhaled slowly. "I didn't move away. I was erased." Silence on the line. Then quietly, Riley added, "I know she's done awful things. I never thought she'd go this far, though. I found an envelope once Mom gave it to Greg. I didn't see everything inside, but there were photos, documents. Something about ownership." Maggie leaned forward, gripping the arm of the chair. "Do you still have it?" "No," Riley whispered. "I was 13. I didn't know it mattered." There was a pause, then a muffled sniff. "I always felt like I didn't belong. Like I was placed there to serve some other purpose. A pawn, not a daughter. And now I think, maybe that's exactly what I was." "You're not a pawn," Maggie said, her voice low but firm. "You're the first person brave enough to call me back. That matters." There was a pause. Then Riley's voice came stronger. "I want to meet. But I can't be around Vanessa or Greg. If I'm going to talk, I have to feel safe." "I understand," Maggie said. "We'll make it happen." Riley took a deep breath. "Thank you. I didn't expect to find someone like you on the other side of this." As the line went dead, Maggie sat for a moment, the phone resting in her lap. Then she reached for her notepad and wrote down Riley's name with a trembling but determined hand. From the hallway, Joseph appeared holding his coat. Maggie looked up at him, eyes steady. "On the 12th. We're going to need a witness no one sees coming." The conference room at Maple Falls Community Center was colder than expected, both in temperature and tone. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile hue over the long wooden table. Around it sat faces Maggie once called family. Now they stared at her as though she were a ghost who had crossed a line by showing up. She stepped inside quietly, her coat buttoned up to her throat, eyes steady. She held no anger in her hands, only a slim folder, and a truth she no longer had the luxury of burying. Vanessa rose from her seat, almost instantly sleek in a navy blazer, her eyes sharp and unforgiving. "You weren't invited," she said flatly, gesturing to the lone empty chair at the corner of the room. "That seat isn't for you. This is a meeting of current property owners." Maggie's eyes drifted to the chair. It had no nameplate, no cushion. Just 4 wooden legs and silence. She moved toward it anyway, placing her folder on the table with quiet purpose. "You're right," she said. "That seat isn't mine. But the house was. And according to the legal records from Greystone and Cole, my name was never legally removed. It was only delayed." She opened the folder and slid a copy of the 2018 property draft forward. Her name was there in ink, Margaret Pierce, listed as joint owner. Greg stiffened, his jaw tensing. Caleb's eyes flicked down to the page, then up to his grandmother. Vanessa, unbothered on the surface, didn't sit back down. Even if that were true, the estate has evolved since then. Greg handled everything according to the law. But the law, Maggie said, voice low, requires transparency, something you've never been fond of. Before Vanessa could reply, the door opened behind them. Riley stepped in, nervous, uncertain, but unmistakably present. Her eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Greg, before settling on Maggie. Then she stepped forward. "I have a question," she said, addressing the table. "If Greg Pierce isn't my father, then why did he sign the hospital intake forms as if he were?" Maggie turned toward her, calm, but alert. Vanessa's lips tightened, and Greg looked like someone had drained the color from his face. Riley reached into her coat and pulled out a creased sheet of paper. "This is a copy of the medical authorization form from 2019, she said. "I was hospitalized that summer. Vanessa wasn't reachable. The staff called Greg. He came. He signed this." She laid it beside Maggie's documents on the table, the paper trembling only slightly in her fingers. Greg finally found his voice. I was just trying to help." Riley looked at him, tears building behind a practiced shield of detachment. "No. You told Vanessa I was an unnecessary obstacle, that I was going to ruin everything if anyone found out." There was silence. Caleb looked between his father and Riley, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Then Riley took out something else, a letter written in faded ink. "This is from my biological father. He passed away 2 years ago. In it, he confirms that Vanessa told him I was being raised by Greg as part of a convenient solution." She placed it gently next to the rest. All eyes returned to the growing pile of evidence in the center of the table. Maggie didn't speak. She didn't need to. For once, the truth was doing the talking. Greg sat in stunned silence. For a long while, no one spoke. The documents lay still at the center of the table, but their weight rippled outward like dropped stones. Vanessa's expression hardened cracks, showing only in the tight press of her lips, the flare in her nostrils. Maggie stayed seated, hands folded loosely in her lap. She didn't smile. Dignity didn't need grins, it just needed presence. "I've kept quiet a long time," she said softly, looking not at Vanessa, but at Greg. "After your father died, I thought maybe the best thing I could do was disappear. Quietly. Let you build your life without me being in the way." Greg's eyes dropped to the edge of the table. But disappearing quietly isn't the same as giving up ownership. It isn't the same as forgetting who I was in this family. Caleb, who had been watching the floor for most of the exchange, finally shifted in his chair. His voice came out soft, almost apologetic. "Mum," he said, turning to Vanessa, "is any of this true?" Vanessa didn't answer. She looked at the chair Maggie had claimed then, at the empty ones around her, silent, glaring reminders of the control she had assumed no one would question. Joseph Randall, seated quietly near the back, cleared his throat just enough to break the tension. "There's more," he said, standing. "The original will, before it went missing, had an addendum. It left the house in shared ownership with provisions for long-term care of Mrs. Pierce, and a clause about transparency regarding financial decisions." He held up a copy. "We'll be submitting it to probate, and we're reopening the inquiry into how the revised documents were processed without standard notifications." Vanessa looked like she might argue, but then Riley stood up. "I didn't ask to be part of this," she said quietly, "but I won't be a shadow in someone else's lie. I'm not a pawn, and I'm not your eraser." Vanessa's jaw clenched. "You don't know what I've done for this family." Riley's voice didn't rise, but it didn't shake either. "No, but I know what you've done to it." The room went still again. Greg slowly stood. His voice was almost a whisper. "Mom." He looked at Maggie but didn't finish the sentence. His face was pale. His hands trembled. Then Caleb, now standing too, turned toward his father. Dad, I need to know. What else has been hidden from me? Greg's shoulders sank as if someone had pulled the last thread holding him upright. Vanessa, realizing the shift, stepped forward, but no one reached for her hand. Not this time. Maggie rose from her chair. She walked over to the table, gathered the documents back into her folder, and turned to face them all. I didn't come here to punish, she said. But truth is a kind of grace, even when it hurts. She paused, then turned her eyes toward Caleb. And you, sweetheart. You asked me once if I thought your mother had hidden things from you. He nodded slowly. She placed a hand gently on his arm. I think you're finally ready to answer that yourself. As she stepped away, the sound of her shoes echoed lightly across the linoleum floor. Behind her, silence remained, but it was not the silence of denial. It was the silence of something crumbling. And somewhere in that quiet, a single chair, once left empty, stood not as rejection, but as invitation. It was still warm. The parking lot behind the community centre was nearly empty. Only 2 cars remained under the dim yellow lights that hummed faintly above. A soft wind swept loose leaves into circles, and somewhere nearby a dog barked once and then fell silent. Maggie stood with her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her coat, buttoned all the way up, fluttered gently at the hem. Greg stood opposite her, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. He looked older in the light, as if the evening had drained him. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then Maggie stepped closer. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the cool air like a string pulled taut. Greg, she said, when you were a boy, I used to write your name on the inside cover of every book I gave you. Greg blinked his brow, furrowing. So that if it ever got lost, she continued, it could find its way back to you. He swallowed, but didn't speak. And now Maggie said, her eyes searching his face. You've let someone erase my name from your life. Just like that. The words didn't accuse, they mourned. Greg shifted his weight, looked down at the pavement, then back up. It wasn't intentional, he said. I didn't realize how far things had gone. You didn't ask, Maggie replied gently. You didn't want to know. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Carefully, deliberately, she unfolded it and handed it to him. It's a letter, she said. From your father. Joseph found it among the old files. Your father left it for you. Greg hesitated before taking it. I didn't know there was a letter, he said softly. I know, she replied. He opened it slowly as if it might break. His eyes scanned the page. Maggie watched him. Watched the twitch of his mouth, the way his chest rose and fell more heavily with each line he read. She could tell the moment he got to the final paragraph. His hand trembled. Greg closed his eyes. I should have, he began, but the words caught in his throat. His shoulders buckled under a weight too long, carried too long, ignored. I should have read everything. I should have asked more. I should have... His voice broke. Tears came not loudly, not messily, but real. The kind that didn't need sobs to be heard. Maggie didn't move to hold him. She didn't need to. Instead, she stepped forward and placed the letter back into his hands. Your father asked you not to lose the one person who always stood by you, she said. That's what he wrote. Do you understand now why I came back? Greg nodded, his eyes red. I didn't want to see, he admitted. It was easier not to. Maggie gave a small, sad smile. I know, but truth doesn't vanish just because we turn away. A door creaked open in the distance. Riley stood there, silhouetted in the light from inside. She didn't speak, just waited. Greg wiped his face with the back of his hand. He looked at Maggie, really looked at her maybe for the first time in years. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. Maggie stepped back, the wind catching a strand of her hair. "You start," she said by remembering. He looked confused, by remembering what he asked. She turned to go, her voice carrying back to him like a lullaby long forgotten. "I don't need the house back, Greg. I just need my place as your mother in the memory you still have left." Morning filtered softly through the curtains, brushing the edge of the small kitchen table, where a steaming pot of tea waited beside a neat, worn notebook. Outside, birds called from branches just beginning to bud, and the world felt quieter than usual, as if it too was pausing to watch someone leave gently. Maggie stood at the threshold of her new rental cottage, just 2 rooms, tucked near the edge of Maple Falls forest line. It was modest, almost spare, but filled with light and silence of the kind she hadn't known in years. The single suitcase beside her contained only clothes and 2 well-worn books. On the table sat a small framed photo of Caleb as a boy, a folded letter addressed simply Greg, and a tiny potted orange tree, barely a sapling, no more than 2 leaves, and a dream. Joseph waited outside, leaning on the open car door, not saying much. He had learned over time that some moments didn't require words, just presence. Inside, Maggie turned as she heard a knock. Caleb stood there, eyes unsure, but face open. "I wanted to say goodbye," he said. "If you'll let me." Maggie nodded. He stepped inside, glancing around the sparse room. His eyes settled on the orange tree. "You're really leaving?" he murmured. "I was never staying," she replied, her voice kind. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a sealed envelope, thicker than the one for Greg. She handed it to Caleb. "This is for you," she said. "Not now. Later when you're ready." He held it carefully, like it might dissolve under too much pressure. "What is it?" "Everything," she said. "But not in the way you think. It's not about proving anything. It's just about seeing clearly when the fog lifts." He nodded slowly. "I'll visit," he added, "if you want." Maggie smiled, gentle, like spring sun through trees. "I'd like that very much." There was another knock, this time the courier, a letter in hand. "It's from Riley," the man said. Maggie opened it quietly. Inside was a photo, freshly printed, of the old house's backyard. The angle was familiar, the corner where the old orange tree had once stood. Now a new one had been planted in its place, small, like hers. On the back of the photo, Riley had written, "I'll let it grow, even if it takes years. Something of you should stay rooted here." Maggie placed the photo in her notebook, then reached for the last letter, Greg's. She didn't reread it. She didn't need to. The words had been enough once. She placed it carefully atop the table beside the teacup and tucked a tiny wildflower between the pages. She wrote, "If you are reading this, it means I've gone. But not because I lost. I've simply chosen not to stay where memory is not welcome. I forgive you, even if you never ask for it. That's what mothers do. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting." She capped her pen, closed the letter, and turned to Caleb. Ready, he helped her lift the suitcase. Joseph opened the car door. As they drove away, the road curved gently uphill, offering one last glance back toward town. From this distance, the old house could just be seen, the porch light off the windows dim. Maggie leaned slightly toward the window. She didn't wave. She didn't cry. She simply looked. And then turned forward, carrying nothing but breath, a tree no higher than her knee, and a peace no one could take away. The earth was still soft from last night's rain, and the morning sun filtered gently through the leaves of a young orange tree, its branches just sturdy enough to stretch toward the sky. Maggie knelt in the backyard of her new home, a modest house in a sleepy town where no one knew her name, but everyone offered a wave. Her fingers moved carefully through the soil, placing small white stones in a ring at the base of the tree. She wasn't superstitious, but rituals mattered. They were how one remembered who they were when the world had tried to erase them. It had been almost a year since she left Maple Falls. She hadn't looked back. She hadn't needed to. Now, in this patch of morning stillness, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and citrus blossoms, she felt more real than she had in years. A creak of a gate. "Hello?" Maggie looked up. A little girl, 6 or 7, stood near the fence, her head barely visible above the wooden slats. Straw-coloured hair, big eyes, one sock slightly slipping down. "Hi," the girl said shyly. "Is that your tree?" Maggie wiped her hands on her apron, stood slowly and smiled. "No," she said. "It chose me." The girl tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Maggie stepped aside and gestured toward the tree. Sometimes things come into our lives not because we plant them, but because we're ready to care for them when they arrive. The girl took a few steps in curiosity stronger than caution now. "It smells nice," she said, inhaling. "Like my grandma's kitchen." Maggie chuckled. "Then your grandma must have good taste." They sat together on the wooden bench beneath the tree, Maggie opening a book on her lap. It was a novel she had once read aloud to Caleb when he was the girl's age. "What's your name?" Maggie asked. "Ellie," the girl said. "I live over there." She pointed to the house next door. "Well, Ellie Maggie said you're welcome here any time. Just knock first. Or whistle." Ellie grinned. "You whistle." "Not well, but I try." A breeze rustled the leaves, and Maggie closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. It was the kind of silence that had weight, not emptiness, the kind that healed. That afternoon she received 2 envelopes. The first was from Riley. Inside was a short note written in a confident, looping hand. "Dear Mrs. Pierce, I started school again last month. I'm studying social work. I want to help girls like me, ones who didn't know they had choices. Thank you for being the first adult who didn't turn away. My mother's shadow no longer reaches me. Yours truly, Riley." Tucked into the envelope was a dried orange blossom. Maggie touched it gently, then placed it on her bookshelf beside the first photo Riley had sent her nearly a year ago. The second envelope came from Caleb. No return address, but she knew his handwriting like she knew the feel of her own teacup's handle. Inside was a journal, one of the leather-bound ones Maggie used to give as gifts. On the first page he had written in blue ink, "You were the only one who ever made me believe the truth matters. Thank you." Maggie closed the book and held it to her chest. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something rise in her. Not revenge, not sorrow, not even pride. Just peace. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the shadows stretched long across her garden, Maggie sat beneath the young orange tree once more. She had brewed a fresh pot of tea chamomile with a bit of orange peel, served in the same chipped porcelain set she'd taken with her from the old house. It was the only thing Vanessa hadn't asked her to leave behind. She flipped open a book, a well-worn novel by Virginia Woolf, dog-eared and underlined from years ago. A quiet companion. She read a paragraph, then looked up at the tree. Its leaves fluttered gently. The air smelled of something beginning. The tree had grown since she planted it. Not tall yet, but healthy. Green. Resilient. Much like herself. The screen door creaked. Joseph stood on the porch, hands in his coat pockets. He didn't come in, just nodded, then tilted his chin toward the tree. "It made it through winter," he said. Maggie nodded. So did I. He offered a faint smile, then disappeared back into the house. It had taken her months to choose this place. Not too close to town. not too far from people. She didn't want isolation, just quiet that she could choose to interrupt. A woman her age didn't need crowds, only a rhythm that let her hear her own heartbeat again. Inside the kitchen clock ticked gently. Her bag was packed for a short trip just 2 nights away. A cabin up by the lake. She'd promised herself a retreat every spring starting this year. Before she left, she wrote one more letter. Not to Greg, not to Vanessa, not even to Caleb or Riley. This one was to herself. Dear Margaret Pierce, you did not vanish. You were not erased. You lived and remembered and waited long enough to begin again. You are not what they did to you. You are what you chose to keep. M. She folded it neatly and slipped it inside the front cover of the journal Caleb had given her. Outside, the wind began to pick up. A soft breeze, nothing urgent. The sky glowed the colour of ripe apricots. Maggie set her teacup down and leaned back. Above her, the orange tree swayed, and as she turned the next page in her book, a single white blossom, loosened from a branch, floated gently downward and landed between the lines of the open chapter. Maggie looked at it. She didn't speak. She simply smiled. Not because something grand had been won, but because something true had been reclaimed. And that was enough. She was once erased from the frame, spoken over, and pushed to the margins of her own life. But in the end, it wasn't rage or revenge that reclaimed her name. It was truth quiet and undeniable, unfolding one piece at a time. Justice may arrive late, but when it does, it echoes deeper than any applause. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to stay standing when the world expects you to disappear. Have you ever watched someone rise after being silenced? If this story moved, you leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Heavy Stories for more tales where dignity always finds its voice.